The air in the ballroom was thick with the scent of money. It wasn't the vulgar smell of new cash, but something more refined and suffocating. The fragrance of lilies flown in from Holland, the subtle perfume of women in designer gowns, and the buttery aroma of champagne that cost more per bottle than Robert's monthly electricity bill. He sat at a table near the front, a small, quiet island in a sea of glitter and excess, feeling as out of place as a worn leather-bound book in a sterile, modern art gallery. This was his daughter Emily's wedding, or rather, it was Julian's wedding, and Emily was the most beautiful acquisition on display. Julian Thorne was a man sculpted from ambition and polished to a high shine. He was the young, charismatic CEO of Innovatech, a tech startup that had rocketed to prominence on a cloud of buzzwords and venture capital. He moved through the room with the easy confidence of a man who believed the world was his for the taking, his smile as bright and insincere as the flash of a paparazzi camera. Robert, by contrast, was a man of quiet corners and dusty pages. A widower for the better part of a decade, he ran a small, struggling bookstore in a forgotten part of the city. It was a haven of old paper and quiet contemplation, a world away from the high-stakes, high-gloss universe his daughter now inhabited. He wore his best suit, a simple, dark wool that had served him well for 20 years, and felt the fabric straining slightly at the shoulders. He was a man built for comfortable cardigans, not for the sharp, tailored armor of his son-in-law's world. When the time for toasts arrived, a hush fell over the room. The master of ceremonies, a man with a voice as smooth as velvet, called upon the father of the bride. Robert made his way to the stage, his heart a slow, heavy drum against his ribs. He clutched a small, carefully wrapped package in his hand. He looked out at the sea of expectant faces, his gaze finally landing on Emily. She was breathtakingly beautiful in her gown, a vision of white silk and lace, but her eyes, when they met his, held a flicker of something he had come to recognize, a faint, apologetic anxiety, as if she were bracing herself for him to be, well, himself. "Emily," he began, his voice soft but clear in the microphone. "When you were a little girl, your mother used to read to you every night. She believed that stories were the most important magic in the world. They could teach you empathy, show you courage, and remind you that even in the darkest of times, there is always a light." He spoke of her mother, of her love for words, of the quiet, happy life they had shared. It was a simple, heartfelt speech, a small, intimate story told in a room built for grand pronouncements. When he finished, there was a polite, if slightly confused, applause. "I have a gift for you," he said, turning to the newlyweds. "It was your mother's most prized possession." He carefully unwrapped the package, revealing a book. It was a worn, leather-bound volume, its spine softened with age, its pages yellowed at the edges. It was a rare first edition of To the Lighthouse, his wife's favorite novel. A book she'd read so many times the pages felt like silk. It was a gift of immense sentimental value, a piece of her mother's soul. He handed it to Emily. She took it, her smile tight. "Thank you, Daddy," she murmured, before quickly placing it on the table beside a towering stack of envelopes and boxes from luxury brands. Then Julian took the microphone. He was a natural performer, his voice booming with a practiced charm. He thanked his parents, his friends, and then he began to list the gifts. "To my uncle, for the incredible honeymoon package in the Maldives. To my partners at Sterling Corp. for the vintage Rolex, to the Hendersons for the case of 1982 Lafite. With each mention, a wave of appreciative murmurs rippled through the crowd. Finally, his eyes landed on the book. He picked it up, holding it between his thumb and forefinger as if it were a curious, slightly soiled artifact. A slow, condescending smile spread across his face. "And, of course," he said, his voice dripping with mock sincerity, "a special thank you to my new father-in-law, Robert, for this charming souvenir." He paused, letting the silence hang in the air. It's a wonderful reminder that not everything in life is measured by success or innovation. Some things are just old. A wave of laughter, sharp and cruel, swept through the ballroom. It was the easy, thoughtless laughter of people who recognized a joke because they lived by its punchline. Emily's face flushed with a deep, painful red. She looked at Robert, her eyes pleading, but she said nothing. She did not defend him. She did not defend her mother's memory. She sat in her beautiful dress, a silent, beautiful accomplice. Robert felt the blood drain from his face. The humiliation was a physical thing, a hot, searing brand on his skin. He looked at Julian, at his handsome, smiling, predatory face. He looked at his daughter, who could not meet his gaze. He looked at the crowd, their faces alight with amusement at the expense of the quiet old man in the ill-fitting suit. But then something shifted. The initial shock, the hot sting of shame, receded. It was replaced by a profound, glacial calm. He had seen Julian for what he was from the very beginning. A man who valued packaging over substance, a man whose soul was as shallow as his smile. But he had held out hope for Emily. He had hoped that somewhere, beneath the layers of ambition and her desperate need for Julian's approval, the girl who had loved stories was still there. He saw now that he was wrong. He met Julian's mocking gaze. He did not flinch. He did not look away. He simply smiled. It was a small, quiet, almost imperceptible smile. It was not a smile of forgiveness or of pain. It was the calm, confident smile of a chess master who has just watched his opponent, in a moment of arrogant triumph, move his king directly into a trap. Julian, basking in the laughter of the crowd, saw the smile and misinterpreted it as the pathetic, defeated gesture of a man who knew his place. He had no idea what that smile truly meant. He had no idea that the old man he had just publicly humiliated was the anonymous, ghost-like investor known only as Viridian Capital. He had no idea that this quiet bookseller had saved his company from bankruptcy 3 months ago. And he certainly had no idea that, thanks to a cleverly worded clause in an investment agreement, he had been too arrogant to read carefully. His entire company, his entire future, would belong to Robert by 9 o'clock tomorrow morning. Robert raised his glass in a silent toast to his son-in-law. The mockery was complete. The trap was set. The gift had been given. And now, the true price was about to be collected. The drive home from the wedding was a journey through a landscape of ghosts. Emily and Julian had been swept away in a limousine, destined for a lavish hotel suite before their flight to the Maldives. Robert had quietly slipped out after the cake was cut, a solitary figure navigating the labyrinthine parking garage. He drove his modest 10-year-old sedan through the sleeping city, the street lights smearing across the windshield like forgotten memories. He was not just a bookseller. That was the quiet, unassuming life he had chosen, but it was not the life he had started with. The world saw him as Robert Miller, the quiet widower who ran The Last Page, a dusty, unprofitable haven for lovers of used books. But decades ago, in a different lifetime, he had been a different man. In the late 1980s and early 90s, as the first green shoots of the digital revolution were pushing through the concrete of the old economy, Robert had been a pioneer. He was a brilliant, self-taught programmer who had made a small fortune developing a niche piece of data compression software. But, unlike his contemporaries, who were drawn to the bright, public glare of Silicon Valley, Robert was intensely private. He had no interest in becoming a tech guru, no desire to see his face on the cover of magazines. He was fascinated by the potential, the pure, intellectual thrill of building something new. He sold his software company for a sum that was, at the time, staggering. And then he disappeared. He didn't retire. He simply stepped into the shadows. He became a venture capitalist, but not in the way the world understood the term. He became a ghost, an angel investor, who operated through a complex and deliberately opaque network of shell corporations and trusted, old-school lawyers. His primary investment vehicle was a fund with a deliberately bland and forgettable name, Viridian Capital. He had an almost preternatural gift for spotting potential. He invested in fledgling search engines, nascent e-commerce platforms, and obscure software companies long before they became household names. He wasn't just investing money. He was investing his knowledge, his foresight. He would provide the seed capital that allowed brilliant ideas to take root, and then he would vanish, his involvement known only to a handful of people. He amassed a fortune that was quiet, vast, and utterly invisible to the outside world. His wife, Laura, had been his anchor in this world of high-stakes, high-stress investing. She was a literature professor, a woman whose soul was nourished by poetry and prose. She grounded him, reminded him that there was a world beyond stock options and IPOs. She was the one who insisted they raise their daughter, Emily, far from the corrosive influence of extreme wealth. They lived in a comfortable but modest home. They sent Emily to good public schools. They taught her the value of a library card, not a credit card. But the world of venture capital was a demanding one. It required travel, late nights, and a level of mental engagement that left little room for anything else. As the years went on, Robert found himself increasingly consumed by his work. He was physically present, but his mind was often elsewhere, calculating risks, analyzing market trends. And then came the accident. A rainy Tuesday, a slick road, a truck that ran a red light. Laura was gone in an instant. Her death was not just a tragedy, it was an awakening. Standing in the sterile quiet of the hospital, Robert was struck by a devastating realization. In his relentless pursuit of building a future, he had missed so much of the present. He had been so focused on providing for his family that he had, in some essential way, become absent from it. The grief was a tidal wave, but it brought with it a strange, painful clarity. He looked at his life, at the numbers in his bank accounts, at the portfolio of successful companies he had helped build, and he felt nothing but a profound, hollow emptiness. It was all meaningless without Laura to share it with. That was when he made the decision to change everything. He liquidated the majority of his active investments, consolidating his wealth into a series of stable, passive income funds. He severed ties with the fast-paced world of tech and finance, and he bought a small, failing bookstore on a quiet side street. the kind of place Laura would have loved. He named it The Last Page, a tribute to her. He filled it with the books she had cherished, the first editions he had collected for her over the years. He spent his days surrounded by the scent of old paper and ink, the quiet murmur of fellow book lovers. It was a form of penance, a way of reconnecting with the world Laura had inhabited. He was trying to become the man she had fallen in love with, not the ghost he had become. He tried to instill these values in Emily. He gave her a part-time job at the store. He talked to her about poetry, about history, about the quiet power of a well-told story. But it was too late. The world outside the bookstore was too loud, too bright, too seductive. Emily had inherited her father's ambition, but not his quiet, introspective nature. She was drawn to the world he had so deliberately left behind. She craved the shine, the glamour, the validation of success, and she found it all in Julian Thorne. Robert pulled his car into the garage, the engine's hum dying in the silence. He sat in the dark for a long moment. He had retreated from the world of power and money to honor his wife's memory and to find a simpler, more meaningful life. But now, that very world had come crashing back into his life, wearing the face of his new son-in-law. Julian had mocked the quiet life Robert had chosen. He had mocked the book that was the symbol of that life, the symbol of Laura's soul. He had done it publicly, in front of Robert's own daughter. Robert got out of the car and walked into a silent house. He went to his study and unlocked a small, unassuming filing cabinet. Inside, under V, was a single, thick folder, Viridian Capital. He had thought that part of his life was over. He had thought the ghost was laid to rest. But, as he stood there, the laughter from the wedding still echoing in his ears, he realized that some ghosts don't stay buried. Sometimes they're called back to service. Julian had mistaken his quiet retreat for weakness. He had mistaken the bookseller for a fool. He was about to learn, in the most definitive way possible, that the quietest men often hold the most power. The first time Emily brought Julian home, Robert felt a familiar professional instinct stir beneath his quiet bookseller facade. It was the same feeling he used to get in the old days, a subtle shift in the air when a founder with more charisma than substance walked into a pitch meeting. Julian was a whirlwind of polished confidence. He shook Robert's hand with a grip that was a little too firm, his smile a little too wide. He complimented the house, the books, the quiet life Robert had built, but his eyes scanned everything with a rapid, dismissive appraisal. He was a man who saw the world in terms of assets and liabilities, and it was clear from his condescending tone that he had already placed Robert firmly in the latter category. He spoke of Innovatech with a breathless, messianic fervor. He used words like paradigm shift, synergy, and disruptive innovation. He painted a picture of a company poised to change the world, a rocket ship on the launch pad, and he was the brilliant, visionary astronaut at the controls. Robert listened politely, nodding in all the right places, asking simple, old-fashioned questions. And what is your revenue model? What is your burn rate? What is your debt-to-equity ratio? Julian answered with a wave of his hand, dismissing the details as trivialities. We're in a growth phase, Robert, he said, the use of Robert's first name a subtle assertion of dominance. We're not focused on profit right now. We're focused on capturing market share. You have to spend money to make money. After they left, leaving a trail of expensive cologne and restless energy in their wake, Robert went to his study. The ghost investor, dormant for so long, began to stir. He made a few quiet calls to his old network, to the discreet financial analysts and industry insiders who still owed him favors. "Innovatech," he said into the phone. "I want to know everything. The real numbers, not the press releases." The report that came back a week later was exactly what he had suspected. Innovatech was not a rocket ship. It was a house of cards. Julian was a brilliant salesman, a master of hype, but he was a reckless and undisciplined manager. The company was burning through cash at an astonishing rate. They had a flashy product and a brilliant marketing campaign, but their underlying technology was unstable. Their business model was unsustainable, and they were leveraged to the hilt. They were, the report concluded, less than 6 months from total insolvency. They were desperate for one last, large round of funding to keep the lights on. A different man might have warned his daughter, might have tried to intervene directly, but Robert knew Emily. She was blinded by Julian's success, by the glittering world he represented. A direct warning would only be seen as the jealous meddling of an out-of-touch father. She would choose Julian, and Robert would lose her completely. So he chose a different path. He would not try to stop the wedding. He would, instead, buy the company. He contacted his primary lawyer, David Chen, the only person who knew the full extent of his financial life. "David," he said, "Viridian Capital's about to make a new investment." The plan was executed with the silent, lethal precision of a submarine strike. Viridian Capital, the mysterious ghost-like fund that had been dormant for years, suddenly reappeared. Through a series of intermediaries, they made an offer to become the lead investor in Innovatech's latest funding round. Julian was ecstatic. The legendary Viridian Capital, a fund with a Midas touch, wanted to invest in him. It was the ultimate validation. He was so blinded by the prestige, so desperate for the cash infusion, that he didn't bother with the proper due diligence. He didn't ask the hard questions about who was behind the fund. He just saw the money and the validation, and he leapt at the chance. The negotiations were handled by David Chen's team. They were swift and efficient. Robert's offer was generous, more than enough to save the company and fund its next phase of growth. But buried deep within the complex, jargon-filled pages of the investment agreement was a single, brilliantly crafted clause. It was a convertible debt instrument. On the surface, it looked like a standard investor protection measure. Viridian Capital's investment would be structured as a loan to the company. If the company succeeded and went public, the loan would convert to equity at a favorable rate. But the clause had a unique and powerful twist, drafted by Robert himself. It gave Viridian Capital the unilateral right to convert the entire debt into a controlling stake of common stock, 65% of the company, at any time of their choosing, for any reason, with just 24 hours' notice. It was a Trojan horse, a financial time bomb placed directly in the heart of Julian's empire. Julian's own lawyers, a team of young, aggressive attorneys as dazzled by their client's success as he was, barely glanced at it. They saw it as a standard, if slightly unusual, provision, a sign of a sophisticated investor protecting their downside. They advised Julian to sign, and he did. He signed the papers with a flourish, celebrating that night with a bottle of champagne that cost more than Robert's monthly mortgage payment. He had done it. He had landed the whale. He had secured his future. Robert received the signed documents at his bookstore. He read them over, then filed them away in the V folder. He felt no triumph, no thrill of the chase. He felt only a deep, profound sadness. He had just purchased a controlling interest in his future son-in-law's life. He hoped, with all his heart, that he would never have to use it. He hoped that Julian would prove him wrong, that he would mature, that he would treat Emily with the love and respect she deserved. He hoped that the man would grow into the success he so desperately projected. But as the months went on, and he watched Julian's arrogance and condescension grow in lockstep with his newfound financial security, Robert knew that hope was a luxury he could no longer afford. He had built the trap, and now all he could do was wait and see if his son-in-law was foolish enough to walk into it. With the investment secured and the wedding date set, Robert retreated into the role he had perfected over the years, the silent observer. He became a ghost in the whirlwind of his daughter's life, a quiet, unassuming figure on the periphery of the grand spectacle that was her engagement to Julian Thorne. He watched as Julian, flush with Viridian Capital's cash, began to spend with a recklessness that bordered on mania. The money that was meant to stabilize Innovatech, to fund research and development, was instead being funneled into the construction of a new, ostentatious public image. Julian leased a fleet of luxury cars for his executive team. He redesigned the company's offices to look like a spread in an architectural magazine, complete with a synergy lounge and a personal barista. He threw lavish parties for clients and investors, his confidence ballooning into a full-blown god complex. When Robert visited the Innovatech office one afternoon, on the pretext of dropping something off for Emily, he saw the change firsthand. The atmosphere was tense, the employees walking on eggshells. He saw Julian berate a young engineer in the middle of the open-plan office, his voice dripping with a contempt that made Robert's stomach clench. The company was no longer a place of innovation. It was a court, and Julian was its volatile, insecure king. His observations of Julian's treatment of Emily were even more disturbing. In public, he was the doting, successful fiancé, showering her with expensive gifts and public displays of affection. But in private, in the small, unguarded moments when he thought no one was paying attention, Robert saw the truth. He saw the way Julian would subtly dismiss her opinions, the way he would interrupt her stories, the way his eyes would glaze over with boredom when she spoke of her work at the art gallery. He was not in love with Emily. He was in love with the idea of her, the beautiful, well-bred accessory who completed his portrait of success. Robert tried, once, to speak to his daughter. It was a quiet Sunday afternoon at the bookstore. He had made her tea, the way he used to when she was a little girl with a scraped knee. "Emily," he began gently, "are you happy?" She looked up from her phone, surprised by the question. "Of course I'm happy, Dad. Why would you ask that?" "It's just, Julian," he said, choosing his words carefully. "He seems very focused on appearances, on success. I worry that he doesn't see the things that are truly valuable." Emily's face hardened. The soft, open expression she reserved for him was replaced by a defensive mask. "Dad, you just don't get it," she said, her voice sharp with irritation. "Julian is a visionary. He's building an empire. Of course he's focused. You can't change the world by being a quiet bookseller." The barb, intended or not, found its mark. He had built his quiet life as a tribute to her mother, and now his daughter was using it as a weapon against him. "Your mother valued quiet things," he said softly. "Mom's not here, Dad," Emily replied, her voice cold, "and this is my life. I love Julian, and I wish, for once, you could just be happy for me." The conversation was over. He had tried to warn her, and she had thrown up a wall. He saw then that she was a willing participant in her own gilded cage. She had chosen the shine over the substance, the performance over the person. In the weeks leading up to the wedding, Robert's role was clearly defined. He was the checkbook. He was expected to pay for the venue, the caterer, the flowers, all chosen by Julian and his mother, a woman with a terrifyingly precise understanding of social hierarchies. Robert paid every invoice without comment. He wrote the checks, his hand steady, his face impassive. Each payment felt less like a father's gift and more like a strategic investment in the final act of his play. The final straw, the moment that solidified his resolve, was not a grand betrayal, but a small, quiet one. A week before the wedding, he had gone to Emily and Julian's new minimalist apartment to drop off the first edition of To the Lighthouse. He had wanted to give it to them privately, to explain its significance, to share a memory of her mother. He found Julian in his home office on the phone with the wedding planner. No, absolutely not," Julian was saying, his voice sharp. "Table 9 is for the B-list guests. My father-in-law can sit there. He won't know the difference." Robert stood in the doorway, the book heavy in his hands. He was B-list at his own daughter's wedding, a secondary character in the story of her life. Julian saw him, and his expression didn't even flicker. "Robert," he said, covering the receiver, "can I help you?" Robert simply placed the wrapped book on the edge of the desk. "A gift," he said quietly, "for Emily." He left without another word. As he walked away, he knew with absolute certainty what he had to do. His hope that Julian would change, that Emily would see the truth, was a fantasy. The public humiliation at the wedding, the mocking of the book, was not the cause of his decision. It was merely the final public confirmation of a truth he had been observing in silence for months. He was not just defending his own dignity or his wife's memory. He was, in his own quiet, devastating way, trying to save his daughter. He couldn't force her to see the truth. But he could, and he would, demolish the false world she had chosen to live in. He would burn the gilded cage to the ground, and hope that the woman he had raised, the girl who had once loved stories, would find her way out of the ashes. The sun rose on the day after the wedding, casting long, clean shadows across the city, while Emily and Julian were waking in their lavish hotel suite, surrounded by scattered champagne glasses and the triumphant debris of their celebration. Robert was already awake. He had been awake for hours. He sat in his quiet study, a single lamp cutting a warm circle in the pre-dawn gloom, a cup of black coffee steaming at his elbow. He was not tired. He was energized, filled with the cold, clean focus of a general on the morning of a decisive battle. He did not dwell on the humiliation of the previous night. The laughter, the condescending smile, the sting of his daughter's silence, he had processed it all and filed it away. It was no longer a wound. It was evidence. It was the final piece of justification for a course of action that was now, in his mind, not just necessary, but righteous. At precisely 8:09 a.m., he picked up the phone and dialed a number he knew by heart. David Chen's office. A crisp, professional voice answered. "It's Robert Miller," he said. "Please put me through to David." A moment later, his lawyer's calm, familiar voice was on the line. "Robert, I was expecting your call. How did it go?" "Exactly as we predicted," Robert replied, his voice devoid of emotion. "It's time." "Are you certain?" David asked, the question a necessary, final check. "I have never been more certain of anything in my life," Robert said. "Activate the conversion clause, immediately." "Consider it done," David said. "The formal notice will be delivered to Innovatech's legal department within the hour." Robert hung up the phone. The first move had been made. The rest of the day unfolded with the quiet, inexorable logic of a falling domino. Across town, in the sleek, glass-walled offices of Innovatech, Julian Thorne was living the triumphant aftermath of his perfect wedding. He had arrived at the office late, basking in the congratulations of his staff. He was recounting an amusing anecdote from the reception when his CFO, a nervous, perpetually flustered man named Peterson, burst into his office, his face pale. "Julian," he stammered, holding a tablet with trembling hands, "we have a problem. A big one." "What is it, Peterson?" Julian asked, annoyed by the interruption. "Can it wait? I'm in the middle of a story." "No," Peterson said, his voice barely a whisper. "It can't. Viridian Capital, they've just exercised their convertible debt option. All of it." Julian stared at him, the smile frozen on his face. "What? What are you talking about? That's not possible. That's a downside protection clause." "Apparently not," Peterson said, swiping through the document on the tablet. "Our legal team just got the notice. It's unilateral. They have the right. They've converted the full $80 million debt into common stock. As of 9:15 this morning, they own 65% of Innovatech." The color drained from Julian's face. The triumphant CEO, the master of the universe, suddenly looked like a small, frightened boy. "No," he said, shaking his head. "No, that's a mistake. It's a hostile takeover. It's illegal." "It's not," Peterson said, his voice grim. "Our lawyers have reviewed the agreement you signed. The clause is ironclad. We have no recourse." Panic, cold and sharp, began to claw at Julian's throat. "Get them on the phone," he roared. "Get me the head of Viridian Capital on the phone right now." But Viridian Capital was a ghost. Julian's frantic calls were met with a polite, impenetrable wall of lawyers and assistants. No one would give him a name. No one would give him an explanation. He was the CEO of a company he no longer controlled, a king who had woken up to find himself a prisoner in his own castle. He spent the rest of the day in a state of frenzied disbelief, his mind racing through a list of potential enemies. Was it a competitor? A disgruntled former investor? He paced his office, the stunning view of the city now a mocking panorama of a world that was slipping through his fingers. He never once, not for a single moment, considered the quiet, unassuming bookseller he had humiliated the night before. His father-in-law was a relic, a harmless old man. He was irrelevant. In the mid-afternoon, a formal, couriered letter arrived. It was printed on heavy, expensive bond paper with the Viridian Capital letterhead at the top. To the board of directors of Innovatech, it began. Pursuant to our acquisition of a majority controlling stake in the company, we hereby call for an emergency meeting of the board. The meeting will be held tomorrow morning at 10:00 a.m. in the main boardroom. The agenda will be the appointment of a new chairman and the review of the current executive leadership. Your attendance is mandatory." The letter was unsigned. At the bottom was only the typed, impersonal name of the fund. Julian read the letter 3 times, his hands shaking. A new chairman. Review of executive leadership. He knew what that meant. He was about to be fired from the company he had built by a faceless enemy he couldn't even identify. He called Emily, his voice a ragged mess of fear and fury. "Someone's trying to destroy me," he told her. "They're taking the company." Emily, from the comfort of her hotel room, tried to soothe him, her voice full of a naive confidence. "Darling, it must be a mistake. You're a genius. You'll fix it. You always do." But Julian knew this was different. This was not a problem he could solve with charm or hype. This was a cold, calculated execution. As he stared out at the city lights coming on, a feeling of profound dread settled over him. He was walking into a boardroom tomorrow morning, not as a king, but as a man walking to his own guillotine, and he still had no idea who was holding the rope. The Innovatec boardroom was a temple of modern corporate power. A long, polished mahogany table reflected the cool, recessed lighting. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic, godlike view of the city below. It was a room designed to make the men who sat in it feel invincible. On this morning, however, it felt like a cage. Julian sat at the head of the table, a position that had always felt like his birthright, but now felt like a borrowed chair. He hadn't slept. His expensive suit felt tight and suffocating, his silk tie a noose around his neck. The other board members, a collection of venture capitalists and industry veterans he had personally courted, sat in stony silence, their faces grim. They had all received the same terse, commanding notice. The air was thick with tension and the unspoken question, who was Viridian Capital? At precisely 10 a.m., the double doors at the end of the boardroom swung open. Julian and the other board members leaned forward, their eyes fixed on the entrance, expecting to see a high-powered legal team, a rival CEO, a corporate raider. Instead, a single figure walked in. It was Robert. He was not dressed for a corporate takeover. He wore the same simple, dark wool suit from the wedding, his shoulders slightly stooped, his expression calm and unreadable. In his right hand, he carried the worn, leather-bound first edition of To the Lighthouse. He walked slowly, his footsteps making no sound on the thick, plush carpet, and took the empty seat at the opposite end of the table, directly facing his son-in-law. For a moment, no one spoke. The board members exchanged confused, bewildered glances. Julian stared at his father-in-law, his mind refusing to process what his eyes were seeing. It was a category error, a glitch in the matrix of his world. The quiet, irrelevant bookseller had no place in this room of power. "Robert," Julian finally stammered, his voice a choked whisper. What are you doing here? This is a closed board meeting." Robert placed the book gently on the polished table in front of him. The worn leather was a stark, organic contrast to the cold, hard surfaces of the room. "I believe," Robert said, his voice quiet but carrying an astonishing weight in the silent room, "that, as the new majority shareholder, I am entitled to attend." The statement landed with the force of a physical blow. A wave of shock and disbelief washed over the room. The board members stared at Robert, then at Julian, their minds scrambling to connect the two impossible realities. Julian laughed, a short, sharp, hysterical sound. That's not funny, Robert. This is a serious situation. You need to leave." "I am not joking, Julian," Robert said, his gaze steady and unwavering. "And my name, to you, is Mr. Miller." He turned his attention to the rest of the board. "Good morning, gentlemen. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Robert Miller, and as of yesterday morning, through my private investment fund, Viridian Capital, I have assumed a 65% controlling interest in this company." He let the words hang in the air. He was no longer the quiet, apologetic father-in-law. He was a figure of immense and previously hidden power. The ghost had materialized. Julian's face had gone a sickly, ashen color. He looked as if he had been punched in the gut. "Viridian Capital," he whispered, the name tasting like poison in his mouth. "That's you?" "Yes," Robert said simply. The pieces began to click into place in Julian's mind, each one a new agonizing turn of the screw. The generous investment, the unusual convertible debt clause, his father-in-law's quiet, unnerving smile at the wedding. It hadn't been defeat. It had been a declaration of war. "But why?" Julian asked, his voice cracking. "Why would you do this?" Robert leaned forward slightly, his hands resting on the old book. "You asked me that question once before, Julian, when you first came to my home. You asked me why I chose to run a simple bookstore when I could have done so much more. You saw my life as a failure, a curiosity. You never once considered that it might be a choice." He looked around the table, his gaze sweeping over the stunned faces of the board members. "You are all men of business. You understand value. But you, Julian, you only understand price. You saw a company with potential, and you inflated its price with hype and borrowed money. You saw a beautiful, loving woman, and you saw her as an accessory to increase your social price. And last night, you saw a gift, a piece of my late wife's soul, and you saw only that it was old, that its market price was negligible." He tapped the cover of the book. "You held this in your hand, and you mocked it. You thought you were mocking me, but you were mocking the very idea that some things have a value that cannot be quantified on a balance sheet. Integrity, loyalty, love, history. You don't understand those things, Julian, and a man who does not understand true value cannot be trusted to build anything that lasts." He stood up, his small frame suddenly seeming to fill the room. "Therefore, as my first act as chairman of this board, I'm calling for a vote. A vote on the immediate termination of Julian Thorne as Chief Executive Officer of Innovatech for cause, due to gross mismanagement of company funds and a catastrophic failure of character." He looked at the board members, his eyes cold and clear. "All those in favor?" One by one, like men waking from a trance, the hands went up. They were venture capitalists, pragmatists. They had backed a horse, and the horse had just been revealed as a fraud. Their loyalty was not to Julian, it was to their investment, and the true owner of that investment was now sitting at the head of the table. The vote was unanimous. Julian Thorne, the boy wonder, the tech visionary, the master of his universe, sat in his custom-designed ergonomic chair, utterly and completely broken. He had been publicly executed, not with a hostile takeover from a rival, but with a quiet, devastating lesson in value from the old man he had so carelessly dismissed. The unanimous vote hung in the air, a verdict from which there was no appeal. Julian sat slumped in his chair, the architect of a fallen empire, his face a canvas of disbelief and ruin. The other board members, having performed their swift, pragmatic execution, began to gather their papers, their expressions a mixture of relief and a desire to distance themselves from the carnage. "Gentlemen," Robert's voice cut through the quiet rustle of papers, "please stay. We are not finished." The men froze, returning to their seats. They looked at Robert with a new, wary respect. He was no longer just the surprised majority shareholder. He was an unknown quantity, a quiet man who had just demonstrated a capacity for ruthless, strategic brilliance. Robert's gaze remained fixed on Julian. "You are dismissed as CEO," he said, his voice calm and even. "Your corporate accounts will be frozen. Your access to this building will be revoked, and a team of forensic accountants will begin a full audit of your expenses and business dealings this afternoon. Any irregularities will be dealt with accordingly." The veiled threat was unmistakable. Julian, who had lived so freely on the company's dime, visibly paled. "But I am not a man who believes in simple destruction," Robert continued. "I am a builder. I believe in salvage, in reclamation. So I'm offering you a choice, Julian." This was unexpected. The board members leaned forward, intrigued. Julian looked up, a flicker of desperate, pathetic hope in his eyes. "You have two options," Robert said. "Option 1. You can walk out of this room right now with nothing. Your severance will be the legal minimum. Your stock options are now worthless, and I will sign the documents that will allow my lawyers to pursue you for every dollar you misspend. You will be professionally ruined, and you will spend the next 5 years of your life in litigation." He paused, letting the weight of that future settle on his son-in-law. "Or," he said, "there is option 2. He picked up the old, leather-bound book from the table. "This was my gift to you and my daughter, a symbol of something you failed to understand. So, your lesson will begin here." He looked directly at Julian. "Option 2 is this. You will remain an employee of this company. You will not be an executive. You will not be a manager. You will be given a new title, Head of Quality Assurance." A few of the board members stifled a laugh. The title was a corporate euphemism for the lowest rung of the product development ladder. "Your new office," Robert continued, "will be in the sub-basement next to the server room. Your new job will be to personally test every single software update, every patch, every new feature before it is released. You will document every bug. You will write every report. You will be responsible for the integrity of the product you were so eager to sell, but so careless in building. You will learn firsthand the cost of cutting corners." He placed the book gently in front of Julian. "Your salary will be 1/10 of your current one. You will not have an expense account. You will work from 9 to 5, and you will report to the new head of engineering, a woman you tried to fire last month because she told you your launch schedule was unrealistic. You will do this for 1 year. If you complete the year, if you do the work without complaint, if you learn the lesson, then we can discuss a more dignified exit. If you fail, we revert to option 1. He leaned back. "The choice is yours, Julian. Ruin or redemption. You have 1 minute to decide." The room was silent. Julian stared at the book, at its worn cover, at the symbol of his own arrogant downfall. He had been offered not a lifeline, but a penance. A long, humiliating, and deeply personal education in the very values he had mocked. He had no power, no leverage, no choice. "I accept," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "Good," Robert said with a single, final nod. He then turned to the board. "As for the rest of you, my team will be in touch to discuss the future direction of Innovatech. We will be shifting our focus from reckless growth to sustainable, quality-driven innovation. We will honor our commitments to our employees and our customers. We will build something that lasts. Thank you for your time." He dismissed them with a wave of his hand. They filed out of the room, leaving Robert alone with his son-in-law. That evening, Robert went to the apartment he had once shared with Laura, the home he had given to Emily and Julian as a wedding gift. He found his daughter sitting in the dark, surrounded by half-packed boxes for their canceled honeymoon. She had been crying, her face puffy and stained with mascara. "You destroyed him," she said, her voice a raw, accusatory whisper. "No, Emily," Robert replied, his voice gentle but firm. "He destroyed himself. I simply held up a mirror." He sat down opposite her in the quiet space between them. "I tried to talk to you, my love. I tried to warn you. But you were so dazzled by the life he promised you that you couldn't see the man he truly was." "He loved me," she insisted, though her voice lacked conviction. "He loved what you represented," Robert corrected her. "You were his most beautiful acquisition. But love, true love, doesn't mock the things you hold sacred. It doesn't silence your father. It doesn't dismiss your mother's memory as old." He reached into his bag and took out the book. He placed it on the coffee table between them. "Your mother cherished this book not for its market value," he said softly. "She cherished it for what was inside, for its honesty, its soul, its understanding of the human heart. Julian didn't understand that. And I'm afraid, my dear, that in your rush to embrace his world, you forgot it too." Emily stared at the book, at the tangible symbol of her mother's spirit, a spirit she had allowed to be publicly ridiculed. The tears began to fall again, but this time they were not tears of anger. They were the first painful tears of dawning recognition. The lesson, for her, was just beginning. The months that followed the boardroom showdown were a quiet, painful, and necessary recalibration for everyone. Innovatech, under the steady hand of the new CEO Robert had appointed, a seasoned, no-nonsense engineer named Grace, began a slow and arduous transformation. The flashy, superficial perks disappeared. The focus shifted from marketing hype to product stability. The company, for the first time, began to build something real. Julian's descent into the sub-basement was a brutal, daily lesson in humility. The man who had once commanded boardrooms now spent his days in a windowless room, staring at lines of code, documenting glitches, and filing reports that were scrutinized by the very people he had once dismissed. The first few weeks, he was consumed by a bitter, resentful fury. But as time wore on, the anger began to fade, replaced by a weary, grudging respect for the intricate, difficult work he had never bothered to understand. He started to see the flaws in his own creation, the shortcuts he had taken, the foundational weaknesses he had papered over with charisma. He was, for the first time, truly learning his own business from the ground up. Robert, true to his word, did not interfere. He did not visit the office. He did not ask for reports on Julian's progress. He had set the terms. The rest was up to his son-in-law. Instead, Robert returned to his bookstore. He spent his days surrounded by the quiet company of his books, the scent of old paper a comforting balm. He was no longer a ghost investor or a corporate raider. He was simply Robert Miller, a bookseller, and he had never felt more powerful. His relationship with Emily entered a new, fragile phase. The anger and accusations slowly gave way to a tentative, uncertain silence. She stopped defending Julian. She stopped blaming her father. She started visiting the bookstore, not to talk, but just to be there. She would browse the shelves, her fingers tracing the spines of the books her mother had loved. One rainy Saturday, she found Robert in the back room, carefully repairing the binding of an old poetry collection. "I read it," she said softly. Robert looked up. "Read what?" "To the lighthouse," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I finally read it, all the way through." She didn't say anything else. She didn't need to. In that quiet admission, Robert heard the first notes of a profound change. She was beginning to understand the difference between price and value. She started to help him in the store, dusting shelves, organizing new arrivals. They worked in a comfortable silence, the unspoken grief and anger between them slowly dissolving in the shared, simple tasks. She was not the glittering, confident woman who had married a tech CEO. She was a quieter, more thoughtful person, someone who was beginning to find her own story among the pages of others. At the end of his year of penance, Julian requested a meeting with Robert. They met not in a boardroom or a diner, but in the quiet, neutral space of a city park. Julian looked different. The expensive, tailored suit was gone, replaced by a simple, well-worn sweater. The arrogant confidence in his eyes had been replaced by a quiet, weary gravity. "My year is up," he said, his voice even. "I know," Robert replied. "I understand now," Julian said, "what you were trying to teach me. I built a beautiful facade, but the foundation was rotten. I was selling a promise I couldn't keep." He looked at Robert directly, his gaze unflinching. "I am resigning from Innovatech, effective today. I don't deserve to be there." Robert nodded slowly. "What will you do?" "I don't know," Julian admitted. "Start over. Something smaller, something real, something I can build with my own hands." He paused. "Emily and we're trying to figure things out. We're talking, really talking, for the first time." He stood up to leave, then hesitated. "The book," he said, "the one you gave us. Emily has it on her nightstand. She reads it every night." He gave a small, sad smile. "Thank you, Mr. Miller, for the gift." He walked away, leaving Robert alone on the park bench. The story ends a year later. Robert is where he has always been, in his bookstore. The afternoon sun streams through the front window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. The bell on the door chimes and Emily walks in. She is not wearing designer clothes. She is dressed simply, a canvas bag slung over her shoulder. She smiles at her father, a real, easy smile. "I brought you something," she says. She hands him a small framed photograph. It's a picture of a modest storefront, a new sign hanging above the door. It reads, "Thorne and Miller, Quality Software Solutions." "It's small," she says. "Julian is coding everything himself. I'm handling the business side. We have 3 clients. It's honest work." Robert looks at the photograph, then at his daughter. He sees the quiet confidence in her eyes, the strength that comes not from wealth or status, but from self-knowledge. He takes the first edition of To the Lighthouse from its place of honor on the shelf behind the counter. He had brought it back from their apartment after they moved out. I believe this belongs to you now, he says, handing it to her. Your true inheritance. Emily takes the book, her hands cradling it with a reverence she had not possessed before. Thank you, Dad, she says, her voice thick with an emotion that is finally, truly her own. As she leaves, the bell chiming softly behind her, Robert looks around his quiet, dusty bookstore. He had not set out to destroy a company or a man. He had simply wanted to teach a lesson about value, about integrity, about the things that last. He'd given his daughter and her husband a wedding gift they had not understood, and in doing so he had given them a chance to discover a much greater inheritance, the chance to build a life and a legacy that was honest, true, and entirely their own.